a lot of the time these things are gut feel decisions. They certainly were in our case. We were in beta back in early 2011. Google invited us to exhibit at the I/O conference when they were still hosting that at the big venue at the Moscone Center in San Francisco. And we got a lot of interest, and it just sort of felt like if we were going to take on the US market, that we needed, and that in this case meant me, needed to be on time zone. I've been doing a bunch of calls and demos with folks in New York, setting my alarm for 2 a.m. Sydney time. It was getting old, as anyone who's done it will know. With hindsight, definitely made the move too early. It is a very expensive thing to do. Not only, it was expensive then, and we had a stronger Aussie dollar, so it's even more expensive now. So it's definitely, worth considering holding off on the actual physical move as long as you can, and putting up with interrupted sleep and earlier alarm clocks if you can do it for longer. It's definitely a lot easier now to get paid in US dollars via credit cards without having a social security number and a US entity. Stripe has made that easier, and there's a lot of others who have as well. But back in 2011, which isn't that long ago in the scheme of things, you basically had very little chance of actually getting paid in USD, because the National Australia Bank would allow you to run a foreign currency merchant account. And they made it a point to treat startups like we had leprosy at the time. So that was actually, it was like these functional parts we needed to have as well to really go to market. So my general advice to folks is do it until you don't think you can do it. Like, do the remote thing from Oz until you don't think you can do it anymore, and then do it a bit longer, because it is going to take time to be able to make that move, and it's going to cost a lot. And not just in money for like offices and setting up and new lawyers and new accountants and different rules. There's also human factors beyond being in a different time zone to the rest of your team and your family and your support network. You've also got that challenge that, what cereal do I go and buy? Like, you walk into a supermarket and stuff that you have spent your adult life getting the hang of and don't even need to think about, and has very little operational friction on what it takes to exist, so you can focus on your startup and your mission, all of a sudden becomes like a whole reset, and everything takes longer. And that's for folks like myself who traveled for pleasure over the years. That's the endorphin and the joy of being able to be in a new place and learn new things. But when you just need to get on with those basic things so that you can actually turn your attention to startup survival and ramen profitability, or noodles profitability as we call it down under, they sort of become less enjoyable and more hard work.
Yeah, totally. And you hit on a good point about not coming too early or moving too early. And at the moment, we're sort of, the hands are being forced in that respect. Like, there's going to be very hard to travel to the US for the next at least sort of 6 months. So that's giving founders more time to pause and think about what they can be doing from Australia. So sticking with you, Geoff, before you actually moved to the US, other than setting your alarm clock early and waking up for those calls, what did you do from Australia to gain traction and to get your product market fit indicators here in the US?
We had it relatively easy in the sense that our product's translatability from running a small business in Australia, which is where we built the product and obviously where we knew how we and our early customers worked, that was pretty translatable to the US. So, Accello runs operations from quote to cash for service businesses. So if you're an architect, accountant, engineer, designer, or consultant, you use our product to run your operations. It's really the central core operating system, operation system for your business. Now, turns out that professional service businesses are pretty similar when it comes to their operations. And so for us, it was a relatively easy translation. A few things we learned, like Americans don't know what the heck a surname is, its last name, and a few others that folks might already know as well, like fortnight is an unfamiliar phrase. So there's a few of those quirks that we had to learn pretty quickly from a product point of view, but it was easy enough to do that by doing calls with beta testers or customer development and taking the advice of Steve Blank and get the F out of the building metaphorically and talk to people, talk to your target market. So you didn't have to get on a plane to do that, to be honest. Now, if you're in an industry which has an incredibly different structure, I think about anyone who works in anything that interfaces with the commercials of healthcare or the delivery of healthcare. The US and Australia could not be more different. So your actual product market fit is going to require a lot more immersion and a lot less good luck like we had. So it's going to be case by case, industry by industry, but the core of all of it is talk to people. And we found reaching out to people in our target market and saying, hi, first of all, I'm not trying to sell you anything. We're a startup who's trying to learn. I'd love to get your opinion as someone who knows your industry, because we're doing something that we think is going to be useful for your industry. Do you have 20 minutes to share your opinion with me? And we found that asking the O question was actually really effective, because everyone's got lots of opinions bouncing around their head all day, and almost nobody wants to hear somebody else's opinion. So when you ask them to talk about an opinion they have, you'll be surprised how many people who are super experienced, busy, successful, and otherwise you would think that they're unattainable will give you that time, partly because nobody, including their spouse, or maybe especially their spouse, wants to hear their opinion on anything. So it's a nice outlet.
Great advice. Anastasia, how about you? What were you doing from Oz before you moved here to get some early customer points?
Yeah, it's great to be listening to Geoff, and I'm trying to relate where I completely disagree and my experience is so different, and where my experience is similar, and I'm trying to divide them and somehow group them to deliver them as bullet points for other founders. So I guess I agree with the point that you can do so much from Australia to really get things started in the US, especially now. And I would actually say that I might not remember all that well what I've done 2 years ago exactly on a day-to-day basis, but it definitely looked like getting up and sometimes, not going to sleep as required to really deliver something on the US time zone that makes sense. In the time that I was traveling to Australia quite frequently, say last year, that would just be a new norm where you are permanently as your customers are considering you based in the US now, for example, and then you're going back to Australia for hanging out with the team, doing all the strategic stuff, meeting with some of your potential investors, or existing ones, obviously, or new ones. And that forces you to go into the same shift, but the opposite direction, that you have to carry on doing the US hours in Australia. And this is definitely doable. And I'm sure that both gentlemen on the call here would agree with me that California to Australia is one of the easiest things. So of course you'll be a little bit luckier if you're working with the West Coast than you're working with the East Coast. Midwest for us is a little bit tougher. It's that uncomfortable 5 a.m., 4 a.m. It's not that great, but you can also explain to them that you prefer calls in the afternoon and select a day where they could do it if it's possible. So on that front, I would definitely challenge everyone to really get to execute as much as they can if they want to go to the US market, as if you were here in person. You can do everything right now because it's COVID. No one's traveling yet. And that is your effectively like the last chance to get this advantage. This season, this year, where you really can move the needle for someone who will not be questioning why you're not here in person with me right now. Because if you were really serious, you would be here in person. We had that a lot, and this is why I had to be there in person. Now we're doing the Latin American expansion and the European expansion. I'm not there in person, and they're not expecting me to be there in person. It's a much better world in terms of acceptance of doing business online. And as you mentioned, future of capital raising online. People are accepting the new norm. And I think that is just so key of what you can achieve. And the time is now for you to unlock it. You can get introductions through networking and so on, but I guess that's a different topic of how you do it.
Yeah, so that's the next question we'll touch on. But just before we move on, I think some of the simple things that you can do also, excuse me, make sure that your website uses US English instead of Australian English, for example, and the content you're putting out targeted to the US audience has those really simple things like metrics and language. There's small differences, but they make foreign companies stand out straight away, and then there'll be some bias there. And maybe dismissed earlier than you should have.
I'm double upvoting what Dave just said. We did get paid out so much, not just for hectares, acres, and Z's at the end, but for hectares and acres even more than Z's, because they're like, okay, this color sounds really weird the way you read it, or something else like color scheme, just call it something else to make that U disappear.
Yeah. So you touched on networking there. So let's stay with you, Anastasia. What have been the most effective ways for you to build your networks here in the US, both when you were based in Australia and then when you moved to the US? Obviously, you were part of the landing pad program, and there's Geoff's AFN as well, which can all help with that. Outside of that environment, sort of what will be your tips around building networks here, which is really cool.
As Aussie entrepreneurs should worship Austrade for the networking support, they should equally worship AFN, and Geoff's work is just so paved the way. I can't emphasize that enough. That is just such an acceptance of how Aussies are great people, and this is not coming because you just landed from Australia. This comes from the people who were there before, who were great Aussies, and you're landing and kind of supposed to must continue that tradition. I think through investors, this is really what I like doing. Like, we get on the cap table people who I personally think are amazing humans, and if I need something, I have a plan and I need to execute on that plan. And that plan sometimes includes, if it's sales or business development, here are the top companies we need to be introduced to, here's the level, here's the title. You of course need to do a ton of homework, find the people, ask for connecting the dots, but of course you can do it. Also, I think just important to mention is, maybe for Geoff, there are some trade publications or some trade things for architects and other people who SLA really helps to do the work better. So it is for us. We have agricultural trade networks and publications, and you're gonna have to accept that Australian states are just kind of borderlines for convenience. US states are like different countries in Europe. If you're doing something in Nebraska or in Iowa or in Washington or in Portland or Oregon is a state, sorry, California or East Coast or West Coast, like, this is just such a different thing, and you need to figure out, okay, are we going to, does it make sense to tackle them at the same time? Does it make sense to tackle them separately? And so Dave wouldn't remember because he haven't started the landing pad yet, but we were there with Gabe, and I said, okay, I'm gonna do California first. I'm gonna land, I'm gonna travel back and forth a lot, and I will first figure out California. We had our first farmer, a direct customer. This was a different model, how we started to sell, just to learn, as Geoff said, just to learn of what the industry looked like in the US. And then from there, we started kind of getting a bit of networking, and I understood, okay, well, California is different in agricultural sense from the rest of the US as a country. And so it is for any tech sector. For example, you will hear about Denver, Houston, there's like a tech sector hubs. Do you start there if you're a tech company, and so on and so forth. So you kind of need to figure out geographically how you want to conquer it. It's a bit, it's a bit like Napoleon. You need to have a map and figure out what the differences are and where your competitive advantage lands, and then figure out what are the networks that I need. Do I need trade networks and introductions? Are they general tech? Is it something that my VCs can give me? And Australia is just so connected on that top level of talent, expertise, executives to the US, that it's easier than from any other country to get connected to the US.
Yeah, you touched on a few things there, and I think, breaking it up into bite-sized chunks is key, because the US is, multiple times the size of Australia, and we're all sort of small teams. Geoff, when you arrived, there was no AFN. What tips would you have for people to build out their networks here while they're in Australia and when they get here?
Yeah, it's definitely not easy. and that's part of the reason we started the Aussie Founders Network, or AFN. There's a school of thought when folks try and make their way outside of Australia that they shouldn't be limiting or focusing their time on networking with folks who happen to carry the same passport. It's maybe a bit too insular and a bit too myopic. And there's definitely a lot of truth to be had in that. I mean, you wouldn't learn about the market you're moving to if you only talk to people who are familiar with the rearview mirror that you've left behind. However, when it comes to succeeding, particularly in the US market, one of the things that surprised me the most was how important the American alumni system is. Like, here, people will ask you whether you went to college, and these are people that would be aghast at the idea of being prejudgy or doing, some sort of profiling. And yet they feel totally comfortable judging completely and utterly the quality of a person they're about to meet or the person they're talking to based on where they went to college. It's the most amazing thing for a bunch of people who profess to be meritocratic and liberal to also be so incredibly prejudicial. And part of the reason that seems to exist is because this market is 20 times bigger. This country is 20 times bigger in population than Australia. It has a lot more diversity, and the university system here has higher highs and much lower lows than what we're used to in Australia, where it doesn't matter too much where you go because you're going to be within a standard deviation of everyone else, generally speaking. Whereas here, it's much more spread out. And so you'll have colleges that are basically just kind of laughable. And then you've got other ones that are, have special parking spots for Nobel Prize winners like they do over at Cal. They're actually full all the time. And you're like, are you serious? The reason I mention that is that shortcut for trying to take the measure of somebody is in some ways kind of a necessary thing, given that there's no way that you can know everybody, and in the time that people have to meet and decide whether they're going to continue to give you more time and advice and support and introductions, there needs to be some form of shorthand for people's sanity. It's not that they're setting out to be prejudicial. And showing up without any of that is a really big disadvantage. You'll see that there's a bunch of folks that went to Stanford for some graduate program or even a summer program, and they will be, sort of 2 to 3 times better off from a starting point than somebody who didn't, just for that little, could be even just a 6-week summer program. And so we set up AFN in some respects to be a form of sort of alumni and support group for other founders to help each other. And it's been very helpful and valuable for folks, not just who are arriving and starting out, but also those who are further along, because the challenges you face are constant but different. And so having a support group and folks with a shared experience and a shared sense of, history, which is really all alumni groups are, is really quite helpful. In addition to that, the other advice I generally give is when you're seeking advice, try as much as you can to get the truth from people in terms of their perspectives and their opinions. Americans are, despite what you might experience when you're being a tourist in Europe, are a lot less willing to cause offense and a lot more, frankly, considerate. And as a result, it's very hard often to get honest feedback. So one tip is, if you're talking to somebody, especially if it's someone you've got to know a little bit, be like, but if they don't know what you're working on, be like, oh yeah, I've met this guy or girl who's doing this startup and I'm thinking of investing my life savings in it. This is what they do. And you'll get some pretty frank feedback that way. But you really have to construct a process to get brutal feedback. So that's something to be aware of. And also, I do see this a fair bit through being part of the Aussie Founders Network and being present at a bunch of the events that we have, is I believe a lot of folks, when they get on a plane to come out to the States, have rightly realize they need to take a deep breath, have a lot of confidence, and then when it comes to pitching what they do, need to express and exude that confidence. And there's definitely a lot of times where that needs to be the case. But if you're going to be looking for advice, you actually need to check that confidence a lot, because there's been a bunch of conversations I've had with really smart people that are wasting their lives on stuff that, and they're just not listening, and they're just hitting their head constantly and constantly and constantly. And I don't have all the answers, not professing to, but when somebody spends an entire session telling you how they've, solved cold fusion metaphorically with their startup, that you're just like, oh my God, dude, like I know 15 other companies that do exactly the same thing, and you haven't actually, when I've said, oh, what's your differentiator, or how do you guys fit into this landscape, or, and they just go, oh no, we're so confident that we're so on top of it that nothing's going to stop us. And I'm just like, yeah, I won't be seeing that guy or girl again. Like, not because I'm choosing to cut him out, but just they're not going to make it.
Yeah, that's really interesting. We often point out that cultural difference with the tall poppy syndrome, the confidence that you exude, but you're right, you do have to check it and know your audience.
Yeah.
Might just take a question from the audience now, just to round out the sort of business side of things before we go on to a few fundraising questions. And it's a good one for the both of you, because you've both spent time in San Francisco, but now Geoff, you're based in Denver the majority of the time, and Anastasia, you're down in SoCal. So the question from Sean is, what was the key factor for choosing San Francisco to base yourself initially, and then time again, and what were your considerations for moving to alternative cities and choosing a different place to build out from? Geoff,
go ahead.
Yeah, I can take it if you like. So for us, San Francisco was at the time, this is, sort of 9 years ago now, 8 or 9 years ago, it was, the sentiment was that the VC community, which was centered around a road called Sand Hill Road, down near Stanford University, south of San Francisco, that was where most of the investment that was going to happen in startups was emanating from. And that VC community had a mentality in the business model where you could stick a protractor in a map, set it to be 50 miles out, draw a circle, and if you work within that 50-mile radius, forget about it. That was just the way things were. That has changed significantly, and as a result, that piece is no longer really a relevant reason to move to the Bay Area. The only relevant reason to move to the Bay Area now is if your target market centered around that 50-mile protractor from Stanford. So if you're selling something that is technology that helps internet scale firms, or something of a very particular, like super high tech, big enterprise feel, then it still makes sense. If not, don't. San Francisco is probably one of the worst run cities in the entire country. It just keeps getting worse. It is incredibly expensive. It is definitely not a smart choice to make unless, as I said, your customers are really there and you need to be in that market physically. There's plenty of other spots around the States. Spend some time looking at your options, and definitely give serious thought to time zones and flight connections back to your, rest of your team. If you've got a bunch of your team that are staying in Australia, which is a very smart model to use, frankly, just realize that you will be spending a bunch of time when things open up again on planes. And so we chose Denver as our expansion office after raising a round of capital. We opened our first office here in early 2018. And the rationale for that was, firstly, that we were 1 hour of time zone difference from the west coast of the States. So it meant that we were still close enough to, in our case, Wollongong, or East Coast time in Australia, for us to be able to work together with good time zone crossover. Not great, but good. And so that made a difference. And I actually looked and seriously considered Austin, Texas, but that extra hour of being on Central Time, not to mention being on East Coast time in the US, any of my poor friends that operate out of New York and have to work with anyone on city time, it is almost 180 degrees out of phase. It is miserable. Their lives are miserable. Their ability to have a shared culture is very difficult. So, so think about time zone, and then the last one's think about those flights. So Denver's a major hub city, whereas places like Portland aren't. Places like, Austin aren't. Getting flights in and out of those places when you're trying to, sort of just done a big long slog across the Pacific is not trivial to do. And I imagine that Anastasia's experience and choice in SoCal was certainly informed by the fact that it's a direct hop to Sydney and Melbourne and Brisbane multiple times a day.
Yeah, great. Yeah, Anastasia, anything to add from your end on?
Yeah, a lot. Definitely agree with what Geoff said in terms of the flights and the fact that although Houston and Austin and Texas are trying to raise their profile as tech hubs, the flights are just too difficult. And Denver is now a direct connection or a very big hub. But I'll start from the start. I was someone who did hit Sand Hill Road last year and the year before, and I really enjoyed the experience. I do have some interesting observations of what happens there now or last year. I do think that if you're after capital, consider where the firms are. And if the firm is in the Bay Area, which is not the nicest place to be, but if you want to raise capital, like I literally for the landing pad time, I based myself in Cupertino for several months, and Cupertino was a little closer to where the investors actually were, in Menlo Park, in Palo Alto, around Stanford. This is a kind of further down for everyone who's in Australia and hasn't really traveled that road too many times. It's a fair commute, but if you're targeting VCs, you might need to be in those offices in San Francisco some days of the week, whilst it would be also sensible to be somewhere away from San Francisco the other days. And you just need to minimize the time of turnaround for conversations, for following up, for presenting to them, and also you, I guess, need throughput, which is why the volume of VCs in the Valley just really helps, because you can get connections from Oz. There's just many people there, and if you earn yourself a reputation, you will also be connecting through networks as referrals, and you can say, okay, well, if you don't like it, I kind of also don't think that this is for your firm, who would you recommend? And then you kind of keep going in this value chain, because everyone's really within that radius that Geoff was saying. I think the other thing we separately considered, absolutely separately from fundraising, I was thinking, okay, we're going to set up an office here. Will we set up an office here? Where will it be? And so we considered Denver. They have quite a compelling strategy to attract startups and other places in the US as well. But I just hear my one of my lead investors' voice in my head when I'm reminding myself of that question: where are your customers? And this is not just hypothetically they're everywhere. No. Where are the first customers? So the strongest customers. Where is that market you're going to be going after for the first 2 years? And I just wanted to bring up an anecdote from the industry, that one of the companies in our industry was acquired because they were down the road from a major multinational. Just consider that. They were out there in a city, in an ag city. They were a very small team, and they just got snapped like that because they were down the road, because they were local, because they understood, because it seemed like that culture would really bring in some innovation into the multinational, etc. So I think the location really matters, and especially if you're trying to localize the product. If you could not spend a lot of time on calls, but actually go and meet, which many industries really love, even with COVID, if you could have that connection of being local and understanding what life is in the area where you're really trying to get traction, you will be seen differently. So I think the customers, like, kind of being the CEO and kicking things off, right? Like investment, okay, once you're done with that, go to customers, or vice versa, generate customers, then raise investment. So those are two things that you really need to consider. The third one being talent. So which universities you want to hire from, basically. Like that's what we think about. That's, I'm sure Geoff thinks about, what other companies are around that area that will be potentially the source of employees for you. What type of talent is there? What type of customers are there? And on all of these, there's prices. So you can quite easily find out either through a Austrade network or through a different network, what are the average salaries in the specific area. And almost all states and hubs, like the cities that are maybe not capital cities in the States, or maybe they have offices that are charged with attracting innovation companies, tech companies, and they'll be able to give you the whole rundown, which I did last year. It's like, okay, tell me about Kansas City, tell me about Denver, tell me about San Luis, tell me about all of the key ag hubs and tech hubs, and let me compare them. And what are you building here? What units are you going to have? What subsidies you're going to give us? What tax relief are you going to give? There's a package of consideration, but there are people who are charged on a day-to-day basis with attracting you. So consider finding them.
Yeah. I like what you mentioned. It's all about the ecosystem, right? It's all about, your customers and the potential acquirers. And if you're on the investment hunt, then San Francisco is a great ecosystem for that. But it might not necessarily make most sense long term. Just conscious of the time we've got left, just want to touch on fundraising briefly before we dive back into some of the questions on Slido. So if you do have any final questions in Slido, please submit them, slido.com, using the hashtag founder. But Anastasia, maybe we'll start with you. Firstly, just quickly, did you have any US investors before you came to the US market? And then can you tell us a little bit about what the fundraising journey was like for you here? How many investors you spoke to? What was some good advice you got? What was some bad advice you got along the way?
It's one of the best questions. How many investors did you speak to convert? What's the funnel? What's the rates? I love it. So just quickly, we did not have any US investors. I came to Australia, I'm not Australian by birth, I'm Australian through marriage now, but I'm not Australian by birth. And so I came to Australia as a non-Australian, and I tried to build a network. I came alone for the PhD, and I basically did the same thing with the US, but I had my Australian investors and had Austrade to rely on. And so basically I tried to really make that protect me and help me grow networks and network for fundraising. So no US investors prior, but many top US Australian VCs are obviously connected to the US, and they either co-invest or consider deals, or as Jeff said, they might be coming from the same school, which is what you need to consider. If they went to Stanford, do they sit on the Stanford VC investment board or things like that, even after they left Stanford? So those are things really that you can consider and tap into. I would say that in terms of the numbers, we looked at it I looked at it from a few perspectives. First, it was like, what are the types of investors that could be interested in our business? There are tech investors, space investors, ag investors, impact investors. Just 1 second. I'm just having some connection issues, but I hope you can hear me still.
The audio is okay.
Yeah, excellent. So basically looking at the 4 groups of investors, you can really then start getting into Crunchbase or PitchBook to construct that list. But the next step would be, okay, who do you connect? Who can you connect with? Who is local to where you are? Or you're going to land in California, and you can say, I'm here for a certain amount of time. And, Austrade can certainly give advice on this, of how hundreds of founders have raised money listening to entrepreneurs and residents advice, and you need to structure that key email that goes into sometimes cold intro. I would say a number of around 50 plus of investors that I spoke to close 3 new US investors. So we basically attracted a capital from our existing investment base, in sequence CSRO fund, Airtree. We have attracted investment from a new Australian fund in ag tech, Grain Innovate, managed by Artesian, and we attracted Microsoft, Costa Nova Ventures, a Silicon Valley-based firm, and Space Capital. And so those were specific verticals where we wanted to excel. We're a big data company, we're a tech company, so Microsoft fits well. Costa Noa is a VC fund. They really help us grow the capability in the leadership, and they've nurtured companies before. He went from Australia to the US, and we're B2B enterprise SaaS, which was very important for us. We want to get that right in this market. And finally, the space databases was with the connection through Space Angel Space Capital. So I would say 3 out of 50, you can calculate the odds. Maybe we had more interest, less interest from some, but you kind of need to make your call of I really gel with these people or actually don't. And once you gel with someone, you can actually try to leverage the situation where you might need more money from them because you're not really interested in attracting someone who, frankly, as a founder, you would not like them on the cap table, even if they're going to be a minor participation. So try to kind of construct, I think of it as family. A company is a family, and we don't need the head of the family to be ruining the harmony for the rest. We need them to support and help us grow. They need to be able to deliver value and be someone who we really want to interact with. So finally, Dave, the bits of advice that you asked about, I think I really appreciated Mick Lubinska's mentorship when I was in the landing pad. He was someone who originally allowed me to enter Mirror Diva Telstra with Annie Parker. There are these giants of Australian tech who've seen it all, and some of them have seen many companies make it. Talk to them, they give good advice because they can kind of coach you, support you through where your situation is currently, because you kind of have a feel for your goals, and sometimes you just need to have the gut to actually go and execute on it. So maybe you already know what's the best advice. Yeah,
lots of tips there, Anastasia. Thank you. And yeah, it sounds like you had a pretty good conversion rate, so you must have been very, very well targeted. So congratulations, Geoff. How about you? Same questions. You're on mute.
Sorry, the button moved before I could click it. Yeah, so we didn't have any US investors before we moved to the States. With our last round, our Series A, I think we spoke to 75 investors to get 2. So there's a lot of, it's quite the funnel. And look, there are other investors. We've got term sheets from other investors, but to Anastasia's point, you know, some of them you don't want to do business with as you get to know them. Like taking investment is in some ways, you know, the metaphor they use is like a marriage, because you're really joined together at that point. Your futures are really mutually dependent, and while, you know, sort of things sometimes go wrong, when they do, the damage is great. So yeah, that's important advice there, I think, from Anastasia, to make sure that you're working with people that you really want to keep working with. Yeah, I would recommend not to think that you're going to have any meaningful meetings on a fly-in, fly-out basis. It's common to hear it, and it shows a lack of commitment to the market, a lack of commitment to the business. Now, that doesn't mean that you actually have to pick up and move your life, but you can choose what you emphasize. So definitely, in my opinion at least, never send an email going, oh, I'm going to be in the Bay Area for a week, can you meet with me? Go on, forget about it, right? Like, it's like, oh, cool, yep. We've just got our startup in a beta, we're seeing really strong traction. You know, let me know if you'd like to connect and we can meet up for a coffee or something. Normally I'm based in the city, but I'm going to be down the peninsula next week. And that will get a bite, much more likely. But the kind of like, you know, day tripper experience is going to get you nowhere. Cold emails is a tough way to do it. Introductions are key. And anyone who's been in the game for long knows the importance of the double opt-in intro. I won't rehash it because we're short on time, but the short version is, if you want to get connected with an investor that you don't already have a direct personal relationship with, then find somebody that you do have a relationship with that's connected mutually, and then send that person, hi, you know, Sally, I notice you're connected to Tom over at, you know, such and such fund. What we're doing should be interesting for Tom, because I can see Tom has backed company A, B, and C, because you've used Crunchbase to do that research. If you know Tom well enough and feel like making an intro, confident enough to make an intro on my behalf, I've put an email below for you that'll make life easy. And then down below is the email that Sally would be writing to Tom. So Sally can copy, paste, make a few edits and hit send. That is how you make the intros. So yeah, definitely do that.
Yeah. And so I think we might, in the time we've got left, try and hit 2 questions from the chat. With travel to the US being off the cards for 6 months, Darren's considering placing someone here for a sort of 12-month contract to do some local rep work, probably sales or BD, reading between the lines. Any advice founders who might be looking to put someone in place in the US to work remotely with them while they can't be traveling in and out?
Obviously, it's uncommon times, so uncommon measures may be required, but I generally recommend against that. You know, no one really sells an early stage business's vision and mission and dream and has somebody make an irrational decision like to spend money with that startup when they may not be around in 6 months. Nobody does that like one of the founders or the principals of the business. And when you add that to the fact that the kinds of folks that are out there touting for, hey, I'd love to be the person who sets up here in this market, are generally not the kinds of people you ever want to work with. Not exclusively, I'm sure there's some good ones out there, but the number of spibs that are out there watching you show up like a pigeon and convincing you to part with a whole bunch of equity and a really big expense account for their travel and a whole lot of other money, and them taking almost no risk. And they think, well, I'm taking a risk because I'm not taking another job. When you read between the lines, they're not taking a job because they can't get one. No one will hire them. Like that representative office person is a very high risk proposition for a startup. So you take the high risk combined with the relative ineffectiveness, and I would strongly recommend against that approach. Travel's hard, but not impossible. You can still get a daily flight from Sydney to SFO or LAX on United in the middle of a pandemic. You're going to find it hard to get back into Oz. You'll have to do some quarantining while you make it from, you know, trying to get back into the first world of public health from here in the States, which is a long, long, long way behind. But yeah, I mean, it's still doable. And I just feel like having some commission-driven gun for hire to be your beachhead is brave. And I cannot think, in the hundreds of startups that I've gotten to know and work with over the years, I cannot think of a single one for whom it has actually worked. And I can think of plenty for whom they just got lined up by some spiv convincing and telling in the world and talking about their network and their Rolodex, and got absolutely taken for the cleaners and lost 2 years of progress while they waited for this clown to run out of excuses and eventually get fired after taking a salary and all the other things with them on the way.
Yeah, super, super interesting insights, Geoff. And how about you, Anastasia? Anything to add to that?
I confirm we are one of the startups who waited maybe 3 or 5 months with one of the clowns before I made the move. And so it was to an extent full because, you know, not probably the worst manager, but definitely what Geoff said was true. And the output was minimal whilst there was even some damage to the brand. Because when a clown represents your business, this is not what you want to do. Let's go to the other question that you wanted to ask, Dave.
I would
to hear more from the audience.
Before that, it is hard being a sole employee of a foreign company in the US. I was one for 2 years. I hopefully wasn't a clown, but I was trying my best. It is very difficult just to work remotely, and so yeah, founder presence.
And there is a difference, right? Here, there's a difference between implanting someone who has been with a company, which Aussie's founders do, and that
transplants work
they're
well.
doing BD work in the States. So definitely, if you have someone who's already indoctrinated and is proven, you can send them out on the mission if they're keen.
Absolutely, yeah. Transplants is very different. What I was talking about is those folks who are actually actively shopping for the next thing to represent. The
last question's easy. It can be a yes or no question. does luck play a part of it in moving to the US?
Yes, but not as much as you think. It always does. But you're dealing with a market and a population that's 20 times bigger with a whole lot more diversity on any axis you can think of. Rich, poor, educated, not educated, all the colors of the rainbow. So it's luck absolutely plays a part, but you're also swimming in a much bigger ocean. So maybe luck plays a bigger relative part because there's so much more serendipity or not. I don't honestly think it's a big difference compared to Oz. One thing that I definitely experienced the Delta with, Australia is a very great place to live from a quality life point of view, who has a society and an education system that results in a lot of people being really good at what they do on a world-class scale. But because it's so nice to live there, those people who are world-class choose not to leave and then choose to spend an inordinate amount of time, whether you call it tall poppy syndrome or the dog fighting for the scraps. A lot of really smart people just basically pour time, energy, and effort into wasteful and unproductive and destructive behaviors because it's a small market with a lot of capable people. You find yourself in the US, it's a big market. There's still plenty of capable people, but I would say the average that comes out of the Aussie system is greater than the average that comes out of the US system. And so, the big lesson that I learned coming here was you really can make it on the world stage. There's nothing inherently that is a disadvantage to an Aussie founder or an Aussie tech company or an Aussie team. And in some respects, the fact that we have to make do with smaller markets, traditionally less available capital, much more stringent employment, or as they call it here, labour laws, those things actually make you a bit kind of thunder lizard in a way. It makes you a bit like the wildlife that we all grew up with in Australia, where they're so venomous because dinner doesn't come that often. If they miss the chance, the genes don't make it. And so the pressure to succeed is high. And I think we can bring that and do bring that to the US market and to the world market for that matter. And when you do get here and you do engage, you will be delighted by the lack of tall poppy and the people who are strangers who will be embracing your mission and what you're saying and what your dreams are. You'll also have people that are blowing a lot of air because, everyone wants to be nice, whereas Australians have a tendency to be a lot more brutal. And so you've got to keep that little bit of a filter in your mind, not a filter in terms of filtering something out, but more like a lens or a paradigm filter where you understand what you're dealing with and where people are coming from as much as you can.
Great, thanks, Geoff. So Anastasia, any final comments on good luck versus hard work?
I think we need to wrap up, and my final piece of advice is, if you're spending time asking us this question, please go down and get down to hard work, period.
Yeah. Good advice. Yes, that does bring us a little bit over time. If we didn't get to your questions, please feel free to reach out to me, david.brown@austrade.gov.au. You should have my email address all over the invites. And we'd be happy to answer those questions for you offline. Thank you very much, Geoff and Anastasia. That's really, really great feedback. We had a comment on the Slido. Geoff is brutal. I like him. He's perfect for the US. You must be on your guard at all times. So I think that's some good feedback from the audience. And so, yeah, good discussion. Thanks very much for your time. And thanks for joining us, everyone.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks. See you later.
See you. Bye.
See you guys.